You hear the applause first, not for a gladiator, not for a general, but for a boy. A boy no older than 14, standing on a wooden platform in the heart of Rome, stripped to the waist so the crowd can see his skin, his build, his hair. Around his neck hangs a placard, its ink still wet, listing his place of birth, his qualities, and, without shame, his price. In the marble city, where senators argued about justice and poets wrote of virtue, there was another marketplace, one that trafficked not in olive oil, grain or wine, but in flesh that would never be free. And in that marketplace there was one category that brought the highest bids, the delicatus. The name sounds refined, almost gentle. In truth, it was a brand, stamped on the most desired boys, often taken from Greece, Thrace, Syria, or Phrygia. They were chosen for symmetry of face, the softness of their hair, the way they carried themselves. Rome's elite didn't want soldiers from them. They wanted property that could ornament their homes and signal to their rivals that they owned not just wealth, but beauty itself. From the Forum Boarium to the Palatine Hill, this trade was an open secret. No one spoke of it in the Senate. No one wrote laws to stop it. These boys were shown off like rare animals, their worth compared to the value of farmland, villas, or entire herds of cattle. Juvenal, the satirist, sneered that a curly-haired boy costs more than a farm. But even his mockery was just another form of entertainment for those who could afford such luxuries. And here's what the history books will not tell you. These boys did not just serve wine or play instruments. They became living symbols in a hidden language of dominance, an unspoken code between the ruling class. To own one was to declare you could take from the conquered whatever pleased you, remake it in your image, and hide the cruelty beneath poet, rhyme and ceremony. This was not merely slavery. This was Rome's quietest, most enduring theater of power, where the actors could never speak their lines, and the audience applauded anyway. The crowd shifts forward, coins clinking in purses, eyes narrowing in silent calculation. The auctioneer's voice is steady, rehearsed. He points to the boy's hands, turns his head to show the profile, forces him to walk the length of the platform. Every movement is a demonstration. Every detail is an excuse to raise the price. He announces the boy's origin. Thrace, not a farmer's son, but the child of a minor noble captured in a border raid. His father is dead, his mother sold elsewhere. In the crowd there is no pity, only rivalry between buyers. A senator's steward glances toward a merchant's man. The bidding begins. Silver changes hands, but the transaction is more than economic. In ancient Rome, to purchase a boy like this was to purchase silence, obedience, and the right to erase his former self entirely. The moment the coin is handed over, his name vanishes. He is given a new one, chosen for how it will sound when called at banquets. The boy does not belong to himself anymore, he belongs to the performance his master requires. From the outside, these boys might seem fortunate. They would not labor in fields or die in the mines. Instead, they were taken into homes of polished marble, dressed in fine linen, taught music, language, etiquette. But this refinement was not kindness, it was conditioning. Every lesson reinforced the same truth. Your life has no purpose except to serve the will of another. The slave market was not just a place to buy labor. It was an initiation into Rome's private hierarchy where ownership of a delicatus placed a man among the elite. The boy's presence in the household was a living declaration. I have conquered, I have taken, I have remade. But here is what makes this darker than most dare imagine. Many of these boys were not bought for service alone. In certain estates, their grooming and training prepared them for something far more intimate, far more controlling. This was power exercised not through chains or whips, but through transformation. To Rome's aristocracy, true domination meant you could alter the very nature of another human being until they no longer remembered who they were before you. And for the most prized among them, the transformation was permanent. In the polished halls of Rome's wealthiest homes, the delicatus learned his place through 1,000 invisible cues. Never walk ahead of the master, never speak unless spoken to. Never let your gaze rest on anyone longer than a breath. The punishments for breaking these rules were swift and often theatrical, designed to remind every servant watching who held the power. To the outside world, these boys seemed to live in luxury. They moved through rooms lit by oil lamps in golden sconces, poured wine into cups carved from crystal, and listened to poets recite verses older than the empire itself. But luxury is not freedom. It is a stage, and the actor who forgets his lines will not be forgiven. You must understand, Roman slavery was not just about labor. It was about ownership of the soul. The delicatus was a possession that could be displayed at feasts, whispered about by guests, and compared to others like a rare collectible. And in this comparison, there was a constant danger. If a boy was too striking, too skilled, too favored, he became both an asset and a threat. His master would begin to wonder, could he one day be used against me? Could his beauty or charm shift loyalties in my household? The solution was an unspoken rule passed in quiet orders to the men who managed the household. Control must be absolute, and in Rome, absolute control often meant removal of any possibility for rebellion, not just in spirit, but in blood. This was not written into the contracts of sale. It was not proclaimed from the rostrum in the forum. It was carried in rumor, in the knowing looks between those who understood the ways of the elite. It was spoken in the guarded language of the palace servants, who knew that certain boys, once taken into the emperor's circle, were never quite the same again. Even before a knife was ever drawn, the conditioning began. The delicatus would be separated from the rest, lodged in a different wing, his movements watched more closely. He would be told that he was special, chosen, elevated above the others, and in this elevation he was being prepared for something irreversible, something the law said was forbidden, something Rome's most powerful men had no intention of giving up. Within the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, there were rooms the public never entered. They were not grand halls or audience chambers. They were plain, almost clinical, lit by narrow windows or flickering lamps. And it was here, away from the noise of Rome, that the most prized delicati were remade into something the law itself claimed to forbid. Roman law, on paper, condemned castration. The Lex Cornelia named it a crime. But laws in Rome were like spiderwebs, catching the small flies while the eagles tore through them. When a senator, a general, or an emperor wanted an order carried out, there were always men willing to do the work. No one recorded the names, no one admitted the command. The boy simply disappeared for a few days, and when he returned, his fate had been sealed forever. The act was not merely physical, it was symbolic. By removing a boy's ability to father children, the master erased his future. He could no longer create a bloodline, no longer imagine an escape into a life of his own making. He became a closed circle, his existence looping endlessly around the needs of his owner. These eunuchs, known as spadones, became fixtures in the imperial court. They were trusted in ways other slaves were not, because they posed no threat to the household's lineage. And yet their trust was built on mutilation, a loyalty that came only after destroying any possibility of independence. Some of these boys came from the east, where eunuchs had long been part of royal courts. Parthian, Cappadocian, Galatian, Syrian. Their accents marked them as outsiders, but their altered status made them ideal servants in a world obsessed with appearances and control. Rome, for all its pride in Roman values, quietly borrowed this practice while publicly mocking it as foreign decadence. The hypocrisy was deliberate. Mockery kept the practice invisible while allowing the untold to indulge in it freely. We will never know how many died from the procedure. Medical care was crude, infection common. Those who survived bore the scars in their bodies and their voices, which often changed, becoming higher, smoother, another mark of their status. And once changed, there was no path back. The boy who had been brought to Rome as a captive of war was now a captive of anatomy. His life would orbit the whims of a master who could end it at any moment, and Rome would applaud his elegance while forgetting his name. In the emperor's household, beauty was a form of currency, and the most valuable coins were living ones. The palace was not simply a home, it was a theater of dominance, every wall and every servant a reminder to visiting dignitaries of Rome's unmatched reach, and the eunuchs, the delicati, were the rarest props in this display. They were dressed in silks imported from the East, their hair oiled and combed into perfect waves, their skin kept smooth with fragrant oils brought from Arabia. They moved silently through the marble halls, carrying messages, pouring wine, attending the emperor's private baths. To the casual observer, they appeared serene, almost untouchable. But serenity was not peace. It was training. A delicatus in the imperial household understood that every gesture could decide his fate. A misplaced glance, a misheard command, a whisper mistaken for gossip, any of these could draw the emperor's displeasure. And displeasure from the most powerful man in the world was often a death sentence. Some, like Sporus, the infamous youth Nero called his wife, were drawn into public spectacle, made to appear beside the emperor as a living emblem of control. The ceremony was not love. It was theater designed to humiliate enemies and remind Rome that the emperor could bend reality to his will. If he declared a boy a bride, then a boy was a bride, and no senator could protest without risking his own life. Others were kept out of sight, hidden in the private chambers of the palace. They became confidants, attendants, and silent witnesses to political intrigue. Their altered status meant they could be trusted in rooms where alliances were formed and rivals destroyed. They could pass messages no free man would dare to carry. In a world where bloodlines meant everything, these eunuchs existed outside the rules, which made them both useful and expendable. And here is the, truth. Rome never spoke aloud. These boys were not just servants, they were mirrors. To the emperor and his court, they reflected the intoxicating fantasy that power could remake the human form itself, that a man could take a life, erase its past, strip it of its future, and keep it preserved like a jewel locked forever in its setting. They were not born this way, they were made, and in their making, Rome revealed its most dangerous secret. Power is not content to rule men. It must own them entirely. A chain around the wrist can be broken, a wall can be climbed, but the most perfect prison is built inside the mind. The imperial household understood this better than any fortress engineer. The delicatus did not simply serve. He was reshaped. Every day began and ended with rituals designed to remind him of his place. He rose before the sun, bathed under supervision, dressed in garments chosen by another's hand. His meals were small but refined, enough to keep him healthy, never enough to make him forget that he was dependent on his master for every bite. Speech was controlled. In the palace, a boy learned which words could be spoken, which must be swallowed, and which were forbidden even in thought. This was not superstition, it was survival. Servants disappeared for less than a misplaced sentence. Praise was rare, deliberate, and dangerous. A kind word from the emperor could lift a boy into a position of favor, but it also painted a target on his back. Rival attendants watched for signs of weakness. Jealousy spread like disease in these corridors, and one whispered accusation could end a life. The boys were taught to believe their altered state was a gift, a mark of special selection. They were told they were above other slaves, closer to the heart of power than most citizens could dream of standing. But this was the cruelest lie. They were not close to power. They were its instruments, tuned to serve the will of men who measured their worth in obedience alone. And here's the truth that echoes far beyond Rome. Once a man accepts the bars in his mind, the chains on his body no longer matter. That is the essence of total control. If you are still here, still listening, it means part of you refuses to be owned by any man, any system, any empire. Lock that refusal into your identity. Type it twice in the comments so it cannot be erased. I do not bow. Remember that phrase, because as we descend further, you'll see how Rome perfected a form of domination that still survives today. Only the names and the walls have changed. In Rome's marble dining halls, the real audience was never the guests. It was the master himself. Banquets were theaters, and every guest, every cup of wine, every flicker of lamplight was part of a carefully staged display. At the center of it all were the boys. They moved silently between couches, pouring Falernian wine into silver cups, their tunics cut to reveal what their masters wanted noticed. They played the lyre in soft, deliberate tones when the conversation lagged. They recited verses of Catullus or Virgil from memory, their voices carrying just enough to remind the room of their refinement. To the invited elite, these boys were not people. They were living proof of their host's power, the kind of power that could cross oceans, topple cities, and pluck a child from a foreign land to place him here, trained and perfected for the pleasure of the room. There was a language in these displays, one most Romans would never understand. The way a boy was dressed signaled status. The jewelry he wore, the way his hair was styled, even the order in which he served guests, all of it told those in the know what the master wanted them to see. Some boys were meant to charm, others to intimidate. All were meant to remind rivals that the man hosting this feast had the resources and the ruthlessness to own beauty itself. But the performance was not only for the guests, it was for the boys themselves. Every smile, every bow, every rehearsed phrase reinforced the reality of their captivity. This was the life now. The applause at the end of the evening was not for them. It was for the master who owned them. And there was danger in perfection. The better a boy performed, the more he was noticed. The more he was noticed, the more likely he was to become the center of another man's envy or desire. Either could lead to his removal from the household, sometimes in chains, sometimes in silence, never to return. The banquet ended, the guests left, the lamps were extinguished. But for the boys, the performance never stopped. In the palace, in the villa, in the quiet of the master's private chambers, the stage was always set, and they were always on it. Inside the imperial palace, politics was not waged only in the Senate or on the battlefield. It unfolded in whispers, in exchanged glances, in the quiet movements of those no one thought worth noticing. The boys, silent, ever-present, became perfect instruments for this invisible war. A delicatus could be made to carry a sealed note to a senator, a foreign envoy, or a rival general. He could linger in a doorway, appearing to dust a statue, while in reality hearing every word of a private discussion. In rooms where armed guards were forbidden, a boy could slip in under the pretext of serving wine, absorbing intelligence his master could later exploit. Their altered status made them useful beyond measure. They had no families to contact, no wives or children to betray secrets to. They existed entirely within the palace ecosystem, and because they were seen as ornaments rather than actors, no one thought to guard their tongues or their ears. Some became confidants to the most dangerous men in Rome, learning details that could topple estates, ruin reputations, or spark civil war. But to carry such knowledge was as dangerous as holding a blade's edge in your bare hand. A single misstep could bring an accusation of betrayal, and in the palace, an accusation was as good as proof. It was here that the boys' obedience was tested to its breaking point. They could be ordered to deliver messages meant to entrap the recipient. They could be sent to offer comfort to a man about to be executed, all while knowing they had helped arrange his fall. And if the plan went wrong, the boy could be discarded instantly, his body vanishing into the palace drains or the Tiber's dark current. In this way, the delicatus was not just a servant, he was a weapon. A blade that smiled as it cut, because it had been taught to believe it was serving a higher purpose, but the truth was far colder. In Rome's games of power, no pawn was ever safe, and no pawn was ever meant to survive. In the palace, the most dangerous position was not being ignored, it was being noticed. Favor from the emperor could elevate a boy overnight, placing him closer to power than most senators would ever stand. But that closeness came with a shadow, imperial paranoia. An emperor's trust was a volatile thing. Today, you might be at his side during a private audience, pouring wine into his cup as he discussed military campaigns. Tomorrow, a rumor, real or invented, could reach his ear. Perhaps you were seen speaking too long with a guest. Perhaps your glance lingered on the wrong person. Perhaps the emperor simply woke in a darker mood. And in Rome, suspicion was guilt. The imperial mind was shaped by centuries of betrayal, assassinations, conspiracies, poisoned cups. Every man who held the purple robe knew that those closest to him were the ones best positioned to end him. Eunuchs and delicati were trusted precisely because they were thought incapable of such treachery. But trust in Rome was never permanent. It was a performance, and the stage could collapse without warning. Stories spread in hushed tones among the palace servants, of a boy who laughed at the wrong joke and was sent away that very night, never to be seen again. Of another who was accused of carrying a message he never touched, his body later found floating in the Tiber. The message was clear. Favor was not protection, it was bait. For the boys, survival meant reading the emperor's moods like a priest reads omens in the entrails of a sacrifice. Every expression, every pause in speech, every shift in tone had to be measured instantly, so they could adjust their own posture, their own breath, to match what was required in that moment. One mistake, and the invisible knife of suspicion could come down. And yet, many still sought favor. Because in the palace, favor was the only currency that might extend your life another season. It was the fire that warmed you, but stood too close and it would burn you alive. In the imperial household, punishment was not always about pain. It was about memory, about making an example so sharp, so unforgettable, that no one who saw it would ever dare to follow the same path. The boys learned this early. Some punishments were private, meant only for the offender. A night without food, hours forced to kneel on marble floors until the joints ached, being made to stand silently in the corner while life in the palace went on without acknowledging you. Small degradations that eroded the sense of self, teaching that even your existence depended on another's will. Others were public. The master might deliberately reprimand a boy in front of guests, not because the mistake warranted it, but because the display sent a message. I control everything, even this child's humiliation. A wrong chord struck on the lyre could result in a slap across the face mid-performance. A delay in serving wine could mean being stripped of fine garments and made to continue the evening in plain, coarse cloth, a visible demotion in status that all would notice. And there were darker stories, whispered only among the oldest servants, boys locked away for days, emerging pale and silent, others sent on errands outside the palace walls, only to return with fresh scars. Rumors of drowning accidents in the baths, or of sudden illnesses that struck only those who had displeased someone important. In Rome, murder could be hidden beneath the veil of respectability. The fear was not random, it was calculated. A master knew that too much comfort bred thoughts of independence, too much safety allowed the mind to wander. So he kept his boys balanced on the edge, grateful for his favor, terrified of his anger. And this fear did more than keep them obedient, it reshaped them. They began to anticipate orders before they were given, to silence their own opinions before they could rise to their lips. They became what the empire wanted, silent instruments, incapable of imagining life beyond the walls that bound them. The greatest cruelty was that many of them forgot there was a world outside at all, and that was the true victory of Rome's control, not the chains, not the knife, but the theft of imagination itself. Behind the towering bronze doors of the imperial chambers, Rome's ruler was no longer a public figure. Here, there were no senators to impress, no legions to command. The emperor was an audience of one, and the boys who served him became actors in a performance only he would ever see. Some emperors demanded constant entertainment. A delicatus might be summoned in the middle of the night to recite poetry or play music, not because the emperor desired beauty, but because he desired proof that his command was absolute. Others were more unpredictable, speaking warmly to a boy one moment, ignoring him completely the next. This instability was deliberate. It kept the boys off balance, uncertain, always trying to please. And then there were those whose appetites were not for art or music at all. In the reign of Nero, Sporus was dressed in women's garments, paraded in public and called wife in a ceremony witnessed by the elite of Rome. This was not love. It was theater. It was domination turned into a public act, an emperor bending reality itself and forcing the world to watch. For the boy, there was no refusal. Refusal was unthinkable. A life in the emperor's household was survival by compliance. You smiled when told to, laughed when expected, stood still when required. Even the smallest act, Placing a cup on a table was part of the performance. Every gesture was measured against the emperor's mood. The danger was that these private rituals blurred the lines between servant, property, and symbol. A boy could be used to signal a political alliance, to humiliate an enemy, or to reinforce the emperor's image of himself as master over all things, living and otherwise. And once the emperor's interest waned, there was no safe retirement. The same man who elevated you could have you erased without a word. Inside those private rooms, the boys learned a truth too dangerous to speak. Power is not satisfied by obedience. It craves transformation. It wants to mold you into something that no longer remembers it was ever free. And once that transformation is complete, the man who made you will discard you, not out of malice, but because he already owns the masterpiece he set out to create. In Rome, conquest was more than the taking of land. It was the taking of people, and not just as workers, soldiers, or hostages. The delicatus embodied something deeper, something designed to be understood without a single word spoken. When a foreign envoy walked into the emperor's hall and saw a boy in fine silk standing silently by the throne, he understood what it meant. This was no ordinary servant. This was the child of a conquered people, stripped of his past, adorned in the wealth of his captor, and trained to attend Rome's ruler as though he had been born to it. The message was clear. This is what we do to those we defeat. We take your sons, and we make them ours. The boy became a symbol of the empire's reach. He was proof that Rome could transform the wildest provinces into polished instruments of service. His obedience was not just for the master's pleasure, it was for the eyes of the world. Every gesture of deference, every silent step behind the emperor, was a reminder that Rome did not merely conquer armies, it conquered identities. And in this way, the delicatus was also a weapon of psychological warfare. His presence told Rome's allies to stay loyal and its enemies to think twice. If the most innocent among them could be reshaped so completely, what chance did the rest have of resisting? Some boys learned to exploit this role, gaining a degree of influence in the shadows. A smile at the right moment, a whispered word to the emperor could sway decisions, but that influence was never truly theirs. It belonged to the image they represented. They were not seen as people, but as trophies, living monuments to the empire's power. And like all trophies, they were displayed when they served a purpose, and hidden away when they didn't. A boy's beauty, obedience, and usefulness were currency, and the moment they began to fade, the empire no longer had a reason to keep him in the light. What Rome never admitted, at least not aloud, was that the delicatus also served as a mirror. He reflected the empire's deepest truth, that its greatness depended on breaking others and remaking them in its image. And that reflection, no matter how polished, carried a shadow. The delicatus was trained to vanish into his role, to let the empire speak through him, but no system, no matter how perfected, could erase the possibility of defiance. Every now and then, a boy would refuse, sometimes in ways so subtle that only he knew it had happened. Some rebellions were quiet, a hesitation before obeying an order, a song sung in a dialect the emperor didn't recognize, a glance exchanged with another servant that carried a meaning no Roman could read. Small acts, invisible to those in power, but heavy with private significance. These were seeds of self that refused to die. Others were far more dangerous. There were boys who ran, slipping into the maze of Rome's streets during errands, vanishing among slaves and foreigners who owed the palace nothing. Some were caught quickly and returned, beaten, starved, paraded as examples of what happened to the disloyal. But a few were never seen again. They became ghosts in the city, whispered about by the others as proof that escape was possible, even if the cost was everything. The rarest crack came from within the emperor's own favor. A boy who had the ruler's ear might use it to protect a friend, to leak a warning, or to subtly alter a decision. These were dangerous games. Power gained this way was fragile, a candle in the wind. And once the emperor suspected manipulation, the fall was swift. The empire hated these cracks because they revealed the truth, that no matter how polished the marble, there were always flaws in the stone. Every delicatus carried inside him the memory of a life before Rome, no matter how faint. And that memory was the ember of resistance. The masters believed they had turned these boys into reflections of their will. But reflections can distort. A single act of defiance could ripple through the household, unsettling the careful order, reminding everyone that obedience was not a salute. And in an empire built on control, the smallest rebellion was not just a personal risk, it was a threat to the illusion that the system was unbreakable. The Roman elite liked to believe their control was eternal, that once a boy was molded into a delicatus, he would remain exactly as they had shaped him, silent, graceful, obedient. But history has a way of reminding tyrants that nothing human can be perfectly contained. Sometimes the break came suddenly. One moment, a boy was pouring wine. The next, he was plunging the blade meant for carving meat into his master's chest. The records rarely gave these boys names, only describing them as ungrateful or mad. But beneath the official language lay the truth. Someone who had been trained to be invisible had decided to make himself seen in the most violent way possible. Other collapses were slower, more corrosive. A delicatus might whisper poison into the ear of a rival, turn allies against one another, or deliberately feed false information to the emperor. If discovered, the punishment was death. If not, entire factions could crumble before anyone realized the boy at the center had been pulling threads all along. The most dangerous moment for Rome came when the delicatus was more than just property, when he was bound to the emperor by obsession. In these cases, the boy could influence military campaigns, political appointments, even the line of succession. And when such a favorite turned against his master, the empire could find itself unraveling from the inside. Senators feared this more than they feared open rebellion. An army could be crushed in the field, but a single boy in the emperor's private chambers could redirect the fate of nations without lifting a sword. Rome learned the hard way that control built on illusion can shatter without warning, and when it did, the fragments cut deepest into those who thought themselves untouchable. The end didn't come with a single decree. No law was passed to free the delicatus or condemn the system that shaped him. Instead, it withered the way empires always do, through decay, distraction, and the slow eroding of power. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Rome was not the same empire that had once paraded its human trophies through marble halls. Wealth still existed, but it was scattered, clutched in the hands of regional rulers and warlords. The emperors themselves often ruled for only a few years before being replaced or assassinated. In such instability, the delicate machinery that maintained the delicatus tradition began to falter. Wars on multiple fronts drained resources. The elites had less time for elaborate displays of dominance and more need for men who could fight, not boys who could serve. In the provinces, old systems of capture and grooming fell apart. The supply of delicati dwindled, and even in Rome their presence became rarer, almost nostalgic, a symbol of an earlier, more decadent age. Christianity's rise also shifted public morality, at least on the surface. The church condemned certain excesses, and while many elite households quietly ignored these sermons, the open flaunting of delicati became riskier. What had once been a mark of prestige now risked being seen as evidence of corruption in an era hungry for moral reform. For the boys themselves, this was not liberation. Most who might have once been delicati were simply absorbed into other forms of servitude. They worked in kitchens, tended stables, or were sent to distant estates where their lives would pass unrecorded. The empire's cruelty had not lessened, it had only changed shape. By the time Rome's western half fell, the delicatus was no longer a fixture of the imperial household. The tradition had vanished into history, leaving behind whispers in letters, fragments in legal codes, and scandalous anecdotes preserved by gossipy historians. Yet the idea behind it, the bending of another's will until it became part of your own, never truly died. That hunger for control survived the empire itself, waiting for new rulers to find new ways to make it flesh. The delicatus is gone, but the pattern is not. Rome's empire collapsed, yet the methods it perfected, taking the vulnerable, reshaping them, and turning them into symbols of control, never truly disappeared. They simply moved into new halls of power. Look closely at any age and you'll find echoes. In the courts of medieval kings, the harems of sultans, the pages of European nobles, the wards of colonial governors, the costumes change, the languages shift, but the dynamic, the taking of a person and remaking them into a tool for someone else's image, remains constant. In modern times, the same impulse hides behind smoother words. It's no longer called slavery, it's called grooming, indoctrination, conditioning. Sometimes it happens in the open, on stages and screens. Other times it happens behind closed doors, in training camps, orphanages and private schools, where loyalty is cultivated the way Rome once cultivated beauty and obedience. The delicatus is a reminder of how power operates when it feels untouchable. It does not just want service, it wants to display that service as proof of its right to rule. The boy was not valuable because of who he was, but because of what he represented, victory over another's identity. History likes to present Rome as marble and glory, but the truth is that its greatness was built on 1,000 invisible acts of submission like this. The delicatus was not an exception, he was the rule, distilled to its purest form. And that's why his story matters now, not as a relic of some decadent past, but as a mirror for the present. Because somewhere, in some system, someone is still being stripped of their name, their history and their will, and dressed in the image of their master. Rome taught the world that this could be done so elegantly, so beautifully, that outsiders might mistake it for privilege. That's the danger. The delicatus we've as never just a boy in silk. He was a warning that when power wears a smile, it can hide the deepest cruelty.